It is 1861, the UK, and really the intellectual world is still reeling from the publication of a very important work in the history of science. Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, 1859, and people were still coming to terms with this radical new theory. It was in this context that Mr. J.S. Mill decides to publish his work on utilitarianism, 1861. So let's take a look at the important concepts, and these will be pretty quick actually, just so that you know everything that I'm getting today is from this book itself. These were actually a collection of essays that he published in a magazine, and they were coalesced and put into a book form eventually. So let's take a look at the important concepts. Like the other acquired capacities above referred to, the moral faculty, if not a part of our nature, is a natural outgrowth from it, capable like them in a certain small degree of springing up spontaneously, and susceptible of being brought by cultivation to a high degree of development. Look there that Mill is already thinking about maybe the moral faculty is part of our nature, meaning an evolved trait. That's why he says acquired capacities. This sentence was literally not possible 3 years prior, but because Darwin published On Origin of Species, this language began to be more reasonable, and it was actually going to get even more in that direction once Darwin publishes The Descent of Man. Okay. Naturalism in ethics identifies some or all moral properties with some natural phenomenon. For example, the moral property good just is the mental state of pleasure, which is a natural phenomenon. In other words, discoverable through science. This position was not entirely, it wouldn't have been considered a philosophically rigorous position prior to Darwin's publications. But in this case, and now this is a well-accepted way of thinking about ethics, where you identify moral properties with some natural property out in the world, discoverable through science. Now, if we have a long memory, we remember this slide here from the lesson called The Mind's Eye, where I ask you to distinguish between intrinsic goods and extrinsic goods. And the reason why I did this is because the hedonists actually say that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. In order for that to make sense, of course, you need to know what an intrinsic good is. Here, once again, we see hedonism resurge, and it plays an important role in utilitarianism. Hedonism is the view that the only thing that is good for its own sake is pleasure/happiness. Mill considers hedonism to be an empirical truth, a fact that can be verified. If you want to know whether someone really values pleasure above everything else, just ask them. There is, in reality, nothing desired except happiness. Whatever is desired otherwise than as a means to some end beyond itself and ultimately to happiness is desired as itself a part of happiness, and is not desired for itself until it has become so. This is a drawn-out way of saying, if you keep asking someone, why did you do that? Eventually, the buck will stop at pleasure. They will say, well, really, I did it ultimately because of pleasure. All you have to do is keep pressing them, and eventually they'll capitulate. They'll say, yeah, you're right. It was ultimately only because of pleasure, or the avoidance of pain. Of course, also going back to this slide from last time, we made a distinction between deontology and consequentialism. We focused the entire lesson last time on deontology, but now let's think about consequentialism. This is a consequence-driven analysis of moral events. All that really matters with regards to the moral value of a particular action is ultimately, did it cause good consequences or not? If it did, it is morally permissible, and if not, it's not morally permissible. Very simple. And from those, we derive, just like that, the principle of utility. you combine hedonism and consequentialism. It is as follows. An act is morally right if and only if it maximizes happiness/pleasure and or minimizes pain for all persons involved. So whereas Kantianism took quite a bit of time to get out and try to explicate this, I'm done. There is utilitarianism right there. Well, let me add a little bit, for clarification, and then you'll have the view pretty much in its complete form, at least one form of it. The creed, which accepts as a foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Very straightforward there, coming straight out of Mill. Whereas Kant believed that personhood, in other words, moral rights, are assigned to anyone who is a rational being, in other words, being able to live according to principles, Mill believed that all sentient creatures deserve rights. Sentience is the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. So, of course, if you are defining moral goodness in terms of pleasure, who gets rights on this account? Anyone that can feel pleasure and pain. So very simple. Side note here, I know that sentience is often used with another meaning, especially if you do internet searches. You have to be careful that you use sentience in this sense, right? Just merely the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. Otherwise, sometimes the word sentience is used as synonymous with something like conscious. But that's actually not what we're talking about here. The capacity to feel pleasure and pain. He argued that we should strive for happiness, quote, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admits to the whole sentient creation. Mill, by the way, also endorses subordinate rules, or what we might call common sense morality. According to Mill, these are rules that tend to promote happiness. They've been learned through the experience of many generations, and so we should internalize them as good rules to follow. These rules include keep your promises, don't cheat, don't steal, obey the law, don't kill innocents, etc. So now that we have their criterion for personhood, sentience, and the basic principle of utility, as well as the subordinate rules, we can talk about the merits of utilitarianism. Essentially, Mill was a politician. He was a member of the House of Commons, and he was able to use his ethical theory to argue for many, many different positions. And now I'm going to tell you about some of those, some positions that you can argue through with utilitarianism, so you can kind of see the benefit of this view. So, for example, one thing that he argued for is the abolition of slavery. Of course, in slavery, one person, the master, benefits greatly from the continued suffering of tens, dozens, hundreds of slaves maybe. So if you were to set them all free, it would be the collective happiness of all those who were just emancipated. If you were to weigh that against the unhappiness of one person losing their slaves, well, then definitely the right thing to do there, the thing that would maximize happiness, is liberate slaves. And this would be across the board, right? So this would happen all over the place. As such, what is the right policy? Get rid of slavery. He also argued, for example, for some environmental controls. Let's just take an example here, not directly from Mill, but let's just think about a paper mill that is dumping its waste into a nearby river, and thereby, making the water there toxic. What you can say is that this current situation, it's one person, let's say it's one person who owns the mill, benefiting from essentially ruining the capacity for the community nearby to enjoy drinkable water. So if you have them stop doing that, sure, you will inconvenience that one person, the owner of the paper mill, but you would thereby be allowing a whole community, many hundreds, maybe thousands of people, to enjoy clean water. Again, the happiness of the many outweigh whatever inconvenience you would cause to the few. And so Mill argued, and utilitarians in general argue for this, for these kind of policies through utilitarianism. So you can look at cases like, for example, women's suffrage could also be argued in this way. Also, vegetarianism or veganism can also be argued for in this way. So this is a far-reaching moral principle, and it seems to be, kind of easy to understand, very applicable. You just think about what would be the best for the most amount of people. Do that. It's very simple. And in most cases, though, you don't actually have to think about that. There's already plenty of subordinate common sense rules that you just have to follow in general, right? Keep your promises, don't cheat, don't steal. So those are kind of just common sense rules that get tacked on to utilitarianism. That way you don't have to constantly do the calculus as to, well, what should I do in this case? But here's what I want to say. However, note that if it is clear that breaking a subordinate rule would yield more happiness than keeping it, you should break said subordinate rule. This is where utilitarianism sometimes gets us into trouble. Okay. So I guess now we should look at some famous utilitarians. I want you to really get an intuitive feel for it. I think you understand it intellectually, but I want you to get an intuitive feel for the position, and then we'll assess whether it's a good one or not. So here's some famous utilitarians, maybe. As far as I know, they never outwardly said they were utilitarians, but they seem to do mostly consequence-driven analyses. So we begin with Malcolm X. Now, I know that Malcolm X had several different stages in his career in the public light, but at least at one point he was extremely militant, and he would say that we need to give rights to second-class citizens. We basically need to make it so that everyone is protected under the law in the same way. And he said we need to do that by any means necessary. We need to restore, or in some cases they were never present, but we need to give minority people in the country all the rights that should be awarded to an American citizen, and we need to get there now. We need to do it by any means necessary, which includes violence. So Malcolm X here is in fact condoning, in some cases, violence, because the end run, the end of the entire movement will be that everyone will be on the same footing. It will be a true level playing field, and then everyone would have more potential for actual happiness. So even though there might be some violence in between the status quo and the target goal, that will be worth it, because in the end the collective will be better off for it. Okay, that's Malcolm X. A hero to some and a villain to others, Ernesto Che Guevara is probably also guilty of utilitarian thinking, if you could be guilty of that. Of course, he was a revolutionary, and he took part in many armed insurrections, multiple armed insurrections, and as such, he endorsed violence for the sake of liberation, you might say, from an oppressive regime. Now, put aside for a second, whether or not communist regimes really did liberate people. Che seems to believe that it really was a worthwhile goal, and he thought that a socialist community would be best for everyone. That's why he did it. He didn't do it to enslave people or anything like that. He did it because he thought everyone would be better off. And as such, he can be seen as advocating violence as long as the end goal is better for the collective. So there's another example. Let me give you one more. This one is most certainly guilty of expressing utilitarian ideas. He can be quoted in the movies as saying, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So Spock, clearly, I'd say a utilitarian. Okay. So now there you have it. Dilemma number 7, Kant or the utilitarians. Now, they disagree on basically every conceivable issue as far as ethical dilemmas go. So if you want to know about this tense battle between these two camps, I definitely recommend you take a class in ethics. I might add, just for now though, they disagree on recreational drug use, on matters regarding the morality of sex, on matters regarding war, even on things like are steroids permissible? I mean, a lot of things, so many things. So you can take a look at one of the classes on ethics if you want to know more about that. Okay, let's now look at problems with utilitarianism. And as I said, this is going to get weird very fast, so let's just get into it. The theory could easily be misapplied. The consequences of following a consequentialist theory could be negative. So let's begin with this thought experiment, the near and dear argument. I'll read this from the slides. Consider your apartment building is on fire. You run in to save your spouse. On the way in, you hear the fireman yell, "Don't do it! The building will collapse in 60 seconds. You run in anyway. As you search the building for him or her, you hear your neighbor call out for help. You happen to know that your neighbor is a world-renowned cancer researcher who's on the verge of a major breakthrough. If this researcher survives a fire, she will likely find a cure for breast cancer and will save millions of lives. Right at that moment, you see your spouse too. Who do you save?" Well, I have a feeling that the utilitarians among you will say that you will save the cancer researcher, and that seems to be intuitively the utilitarian answer. But let me just go ahead and tell you right now that it seems to many that we have commitments to those that are near and dear to us, to our family, to those we have romantic relationships with. We seem to have some duties to them. And the utilitarian seems to just bypass that entirely and says, no. You need to save the researcher. That will save more lives in the long run. Even if you respond with something like, well, lots of people are working on this, so maybe it'll just take a little bit longer, but cancer will still get fixed or solved, cured. What the utilitarian would say, but think about that extra time that we would have to wait for a cure. All of those lives are now in your hands, right? So again, the utilitarian would say, probably save the cancer researcher. Though the application of the standard may be difficult, it is better than none at all. Okay. That was one very common thought experiment against utilitarianism, that they basically make you into a cold-blooded person who just does the rational analysis and doesn't honor your commitments and duties to your loved ones. Let's look at another one here. The experience machine. Suppose there was an experience machine that would give you any experience you desired. Super-duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or recording an interesting book. All the time, you would be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experiences? Of course, while in the tank, you won't know that you're there. You'll think that it's all actually happening. Would you plug in? This is kind of a gotcha question for the utilitarians. So think to yourself now, would you plug in? I bet you some people think that the utilitarians have to plug in, right? That's kind of what this argument is usually used as. Oh, see how the utilitarians only think about that? They would gladly plug into this machine. Well, as it turns out, I'm not entirely sure utilitarians are really done in by this objection from the slides. Utilitarians can easily respond that we have responsibilities to the collective, not just ourselves. So a utilitarian would not endorse entering the experience machine. Nice try, but that one didn't work. Okay, let's keep going. This one is one of my absolute favorites, the organ harvest. You are a surgeon. You took a shift at a hospital you don't normally work at. You were just doing pro bono work. You see that there are 5 patients awaiting organ transplants, and you wish you can help them. Just then, the nurse calls you in to see a walk-in patient. The man is homeless, has no family or friends, and is complaining of a footache. As you are reviewing his files, you notice that he is a perfect match for all 5 patients awaiting a transplant. You could, in theory, give the man a morphine overdose, providing a peaceful and painless death, and transplant his surprisingly healthy organs to the 5 patients, saving their lives. That is 5 lives for the price of 1. What should you do? This is a tough one. Before you continue here, try to decide what you would do. Would you kill the homeless man? Some think that the utilitarians are forced to kill the homeless man and this person, or they're forced to say that that is the right thing to do in this case. I'm not entirely sure. Here is one possible response. Utilitarians can easily respond that this scenario would never obtain. Moreover, should the doctor be caught, people would lose trust in medical institutions, thereby creating more harm. So a utilitarian would not endorse sacrificing the homeless man. A potential response, but some people are still suspicious that the utilitarians are literally recommending murder in this case. Okay, let's move on. By the way, before we move on, this is actually a passage from a utilitarian, Sidgwick, who is actually wondering to himself if maybe it's better that people didn't know about utilitarianism, because again, they might misapply the rule. So let me read this for you. Thus, the utilitarian conclusion, carefully stated, would seem to be this, that the opinion that secrecy may render an action right, which would not otherwise be so, should itself be kept comparatively secret. And thus a utilitarian may reasonably desire, on utilitarian principles, that some of his conclusions should be rejected by mankind generally, or even that the vulgar should keep aloof from his system as a whole, insofar as the inevitable indefiniteness and complexity of its calculations render it likely to lead to bad results in their hands. By the way, the vulgar here means those that don't have a sophisticated understanding of utilitarianism. Okay, let's look at another type of objection to utilitarianism. This one's called the open question. In Principia Ethics, G.E. Moore argued for moral non-naturalism, the view that moral properties cannot be studied with the natural sciences. He used various arguments, such as a naturalistic fallacy argument, which many think was insufficient, but the open question argument is still the most referenced. So of course, I said earlier that the utilitarians were naturalists, and maybe the first explicit naturalists since the dawn of, Darwinian theory. They could actually be explicit naturalists. But G.E. Moore responds to them, and his argument is kind of oddly famous, but here it is, the open question. Okay. If good just means pleasure, then we can express it like an identity claim. For example, bachelor equals unmarried male. Good equals pleasure. But it doesn't seem like asking, is a bachelor an unmarried male, is the same as, is good the same as pleasure? If your friend asks you, hey, what's a bachelor? And then you say, oh, it's an unmarried male. And then he asks, but is that really what a bachelor is? Then I think you can legally slap him. That is literally the definition of bachelor. You are not wrong about that. But now, let's just say that your friend asks you, is good the same as pleasure? And you're a utilitarian, so you say, yeah, it is. And then he asks, but is good really the same as pleasure? That's not a stupid question. That's a good question. What argument do we have that hedonism is actually true? It is even the case that moral skeptics are unimpressed by moral naturalism. By the way, these are people who believe that morality is completely made up, completely socially constructed. And they're usually atheists, and they're also, if you want to think about it this way, atheists about morality. And even they think that naturalism is bunk. From the slides, when faced with a moral naturalist, the error theorist, moral skeptic, will likely object that this property lacks the normative umph that permeates our moral discourse. Why, it might be asked, should we care about the maximization of happiness any more than the maximization of some other mental state, such as surprise? So here, Richard Joyce, really not convinced that when we use moral language, what we really mean by it is something with regards to pleasure. For example, when you say, hey, I think it's morally wrong to, beat up nuns. What Joyce is saying is, it doesn't seem like what we're really saying is, oh yeah, it seems to not maximize happiness to beat up nuns. That doesn't seem to be what we actually say when we say that. But according to the moral naturalist, that is exactly what we're saying. So Joyce here and other moral skeptics not convinced, just like G.E. Moore. In any case, an argument that hedonism is true and that happiness really is equivalent to the property of moral goodness is what is needed. Okay, one last problem with utilitarianism. The theory is too demanding. So, before I read this portion here on the right, let's just think so far about how demanding utilitarianism is. Let's consider our expendable income. I do have a little bit of expendable income, and some utilitarians recommend that I use everything that I need, right? Use that amount, let's just say $40,000 a year. That's the minimum that I need to live, right? And everything beyond $40,000 a year, I have to give to charity, because that would be the way to maximize happiness. I could save lives in war-torn countries. I could, of course, help people with malaria. I can help buy nets for them. I can, feed some hungry somewhere. My money would be much better used elsewhere than in my bank account just sitting there. And if you believe in utilitarianism, that does seem to be true. But that means that I basically can only enjoy my money to the point of marginal utility. And after that, I have to give everything else up. And a lot of people just don't think that that's morally required. That seems to jar with people's moral intuitions. And so it just seems too demanding. It's kind of like Kantianism being too strict. It just seems wildly too demanding, does utilitarianism. But Mill does not really back down. Here it is from the slides. All the grand sources, in short, of human suffering are, in a great degree, many of them almost entirely, conquerable by human care and effort. And though their removal is grievously slow, every mind sufficiently intelligent and generous to bear a part, however small and inconspicuous, in the endeavor, will draw a noble enjoyment from the contest itself. So he's saying, if you really are sufficiently intelligent, I know it's hard, but you'll probably enjoy it. We will get rid of every single source of human suffering eventually. But of course, no conversation regarding utilitarianism is complete without one of its most perplexing puzzles. This is now the trolley dilemma. Imagine there is a runaway trolley and 5 people are stuck to the tracks. They cannot move. They will die. You are standing by a lever, and if you pull that lever, the trolley will go down a side track and those 5 people will not die. However, as a side effect of you taking the trolley down the side track, there is one person over there, and yes, they will die. But you will have saved 5 people, and yes, one person will die. So the math is still for the side track instead of the main track. Think to yourself, what would you do? Would you pull the lever? Most people say yes. I've seen different studies, different numbers, but about 2/3 usually say yes. Well, now let's take this problem and just change it a little bit. It's still the runaway trolley, and there's still 5 people on the track, but now instead of a lever, there's a very large man standing on a footbridge, and all you have to do is give him a very slight nudge, and he will fall in front of the trolley, and his great bulk will stop the trolley. He will die, but the 5 people will be saved. Mathematically, this is identical to the previous case, but when asked this question, most people say no. What's going on here? Are we being inconsistent? The consequences, again, are identical. There must be something incomplete about a purely consequence-driven analysis. Now, this is a vexing question, and there are many variants of the trolley problems that we've covered here, but it essentially is maybe signaling that there is something missing to the utilitarian analysis. And yet, many ethicists think the theory holds great promise. So I'll finish here with a quote from Mill himself. The entire history of social improvement has been a series of transitions by which one custom or institution after another, from being a supposed primary necessity of social existence, has passed into the rank of a universally stigmatized injustice and tyranny. So it has been with the distinctions of slaves and freemen, nobles and serfs, patricians and plebeians, and so it will be, and in part already is, with the aristocracies of color, race, and sex. If only it were that simple.